Hello, your friendly neighborhood host, JT Wheatley here again, back for another episode of the History of Comics podcast. This time, part 2, The Strange Life of Steve Ditko. When we last left off, Steve Ditko was started working for DC, where he had just created The Creeper, and his next creation was Hawk and Dove with Steve Skeets, about two teenagers, Hank and Don Hall, the sons of Judge Irwin Hall, who taught them to always use logic in their arguments. First appearing in Showcase number 75 on June of 1968, they received their powers from a mystic when needed, with Hall being more militant while Don a pacifist. Skeet stated his major contribution would be that he had them say their names to get their powers, along with crafting the community and college town they lived in, while Ditko did practically everything else. Today, Dove has now been reimagined as a woman, Dawn Granger, which remains the most popular version of the character. Unfortunately, Ditko's tuberculosis flared up again, and by the time he recovered, Captain Atom, Blue Beetle were canceled at Charlton, along with Beware the Creeper and Hawk and Dove at DC, pretty much ending his tenure at the company. He did make one lasting contribution to DC, though, when he recommended Dick Giordano, a Charlton staffer, for work at DC. Giordano would soon become one of the most noted creators at the company and eventually managing editor in 1981. Steve Ditko continued to work at Charlton, working on their fantasy series to pay the bills, but sought out new avenues to express his objective views. Soon, Ditko was drawn to the growing fanzine market as he wrote to Squat Trot, number 1, in April of 1959, one of the first. Reaching out to them, he agreed to contribute art and articles. Squat Trot would award his first Spider-Man story as all-round best short story in 1962, which was co-sponsored by Alter Ego fanzine. However, Ditko's relations with fans would always be strained due to his reclusive nature. He did attend the 1964 New York Comic Con in order to dissuade fans from being artists. It would be one of the few conventions Ditko ever attended, and he started to retreat from the public eye. From the fanzines, he set out 3 conditions for contributing his work. 1. Publish as is. 2. Publish quickly. And 3. Return all of his original art. With that, Mr. A appeared in Eon number 3 on 1969, and later in Gouts number 5. However, Rob Gustavus, the owner of the fanzine Gouts, chose to keep the original art and sell it years later. Nevertheless, Ditko continued to provide art and Mr. A to other fanzines, such as Sense of Wonder number 6, December of 1968, but was aghast when it was published his comic in color. Later, Ditko worked with Bruce Harrelson to publish Mr. A in 1975. By 1974, Ditko was producing only 150 pages a year, though he did create the Stalker with Paul Levitz for DC, with Wally Wood providing the inks, first appearing in Stalker number 1 on June-July of 1975. A fantasy series starring the anti-hero Stalker the Soulless, he sets on a quest to regain his soul, but the series was canceled after only 4 issues. Ditko also created The Destructor with Archie Goodwin and art at Atlas, penciling 4 issues from February to August of 1975. Atlas, which was a new company formed by former Marvel owner Martin Goodman, had created. However, the company would soon fold by the next year. Ditko still did work for Charlton as well, such as stories featuring Liberty Bell and the backup stories for E-Man, and also created the character Killjoy. Even this would end, though, as his longtime company partner folded in early 1978 and was bought by DC, of which the same year Ditko produced only 114 pages of work. He then went back to DC with a new character, Shade the Changing Man, in June of 1977, about a character who is a fugitive from the planet Meta and steals a device called an M-Vest that allows him to conjure a frightening version of himself while creating a force field to protect him. However, DC was going through their infamous comic book implosion in 1978, and the series was canceled by issue number 8. It would lead to Ditko to publicly criticize the company, who was still frustrated over Marvel as well. Ditko refused to even talk about Spider-Man. In 1979, Ditko did end up back at Marvel, though, to work with Jack Kirby on Machine Man, while also working for Pacific, Eclipse, First, and Red Circle, a company that was part of Archie Comics. At Red Circle, he ended up doing issues number 2 and number 4 of The Fly. Despite his friction with DC, he would still do various work for them as well, such as a 2-issue Man-Bat series, along with work on Legion of Superheroes and the Who's Who in the DC Universe. Back at Marvel, he also drew the last 2 issues of ROM, along with working on Micronauts and Captain Universe. At Pacific, he began with on Captain Victory and the Galactic Rangers number 6 in September of 1982, where he introduced the superhero The Missing Man, who would later appear in Pacific Presents number 1 to 3 on October 1982 through March of 1984. He also created The Mocker about Tyler Rand, an assistant DA with an unwavering sense of justice who uses his powers to dim lights around him to make himself nearly invisible to others, thus mocking their eyes. Rand would also make someone feel a great sense of darkness when he touched them, thus forcing confessions out of criminals. The story was dealt with themes of corruption and self-worth, thus once again Ditko was using his art to express his political beliefs. Originally, Ditko started working on the concept in 1981 with a 10-page story, which found its way to Pacific Comics, who then published it in Silver Star No. 2 in April of 1983. Ditko was not aware of the sale and displeased with it being published in a comic book format, as he intended it for a black and white magazine one. Eventually, he and longtime business partner Robin Snyder would publish it in a graphic novel in 1990. At Eclipse, he did create Static in Eclipse Monthly between August and October of 1983 about Stack Ray, the assistant to Dr. Ed Search, who together crafted a suit of armor so Ray could fight villains like the Exploder and the Polluter. However, this would end due to Ditko's frequent clashes with the Eclipse's editors, mostly over his inking style. While at Eclipse, Cat Ironwood, the editor-in-chief, began to put together the art of Steve Ditko, which Ditko approved of and even agreed to provide some original art for. Frustratingly, though, Mark Upchurch, the writer hired for the project, couldn't meet the deadlines. Upchurch's lateness would be used by Mulvaney and Ironwood later when Ditko would later turn against the project, claiming it was already completed and they decided to change it after his approval. Much of the friction came when Ironwood started investigating Ditko's past, with everyone, including his brother, shocked she was doing so, considering how reclusive Ditko was. More than a few warned her of this, and soon Ironwood found herself in the uneasy position of investigating one of her artists who she was already having trouble working with. However, nature would finally settle all this when, tragically, Eclipse lost most of its work in February of 1986 during the flood in Greenville, California. Ironwood took it as fate, deciding this was a sign to finally drop the project. Mulvaney and Ironwood would eventually publish Tales of the Mysterious Traveler in 1990, a reprint of Steve Ditko's 1950s book, with Ditko receiving royalties. Meanwhile, Ditko took whatever work he could except comic books, which he refused, thus his work on Transformers coloring book of all things. At this point, he was just doing standard jobs to pay the bills. He did work in comics again eventually, though, with Amazing Heroes number 13 on July of 1982 with Stan Geider, who was criticized over all the characters looking the same. His pencils had become extremely loose at this point, with many inkers refusing to work on them. On January of 1993, Ditko published The Sore Spot in the Crusade, a 28-page essay on the original art. This was not the first time Ditko had brought up this up, as he wrote in Inside Comics number 2 back in 1974 and demanded his original art back. This was part of a larger controversy among artists and the companies in general, as Jack Kirby was also campaigning to have his original art returned. Finally, Marvel gave Ditko a gift of his art, but not all of it. He got back most of his work on Doctor Strange, some of Spider-Man, and none of his Incredible Hulk work. It was not surprising to Ditko and other creators would fight for this, since the auction market of his value could be worth millions in total. In 1985, Steve Ditko tried taking Static to Charlton and then Renegade for a 3-issue miniseries in 1986. Ditko even tried publishing with Robin Snyder with Static graphic novel in 1988, with Static No. 1 and Static No. 2 in 1989. Some of his older material started getting published as well over the next 2 years, such as Out of This World in 1989, a story he did for Charlton in the 1950s, and the Ditko Service Package in 1991, which led to a bitter attack on the comic book industry as a whole. In 1988, he went back to Marvel again with a new character, Speedball, in Amazing Spider-Man Annual Number 22 on January of 1988, creating him with writer Tom DeFalco, about a character who could absorb and redirect kinetic energy. However, he once again refused to ink his own pencils, and the series failed after 2 issues, with many calling him out of date at this point. However, a few years later, Speedball would become a founding member of the popular New Warrior series in the 1990s. At DC, Ditko was offered a chance to revive his old Charlton character, Captain Atom, but once again was too demanding, wanting Robin Snyder to write it. DC would later offer him Firestorm, but he refused, which went to Dick Giordano. Ditko would produce one of his last creations with writer Will Murray at Marvel with Squirrel Girl, who first appeared in Marvel Superheroes Volume 2 on number 8 on January of 1992 about Doreen Allen Green, a half-girl, half-squirrel with the telepathic ability to communicate with squirrels. In her debut issue, she abuses Iron Man and later teams up with him to fight Dr. Doom, leading to one of the most unintentionally funny panels in comic book history when Squirrel Girl sends the army of squirrels after Doom, who proclaims, "Confound these wretched rodents! For every one I throw off, another dozen vexes me." The character has since established a cult following, including the moniker of the unbeatable Squirrel Girl, as she always finds a way to beat any Marvel villain thrown at her. Meanwhile, Frank Miller approached Steve Ditko about reviving his Mr. A character with him, using the idea of Mr. A only depicted in black and white while the rest of the world was depicted in color, showing his contrast with the changing times. Instead, though, Ditko went to Mort Todd at Ace Comics with the proposal of a 5-issue Origin miniseries. Ditko completed 3 issues, but Todd canceled the project due to disinterest from the direct market. He even tried to get options for TV, but nothing came of it. Considering Frank Miller's popularity in the late 1980s, one could only imagine what could have happened. Then Mort Todd, while still an editor at Marvel, decided to do a 40 comic book adaptation of Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. But the Rand estate would only allow it on the condition that Steve Ditko drew it. It appeared to be a dream project for the devout objectivist, but once again he refused. According to Todd, Ditko was afraid to tackle such a project and depict characters his own way after they had been established for decades, despite the fact the Rand estate said they would approve whatever he came up with. Thus, another brilliant opportunity slipped through Ditko's hands. Then the Henson Productions offered him a job through artist Craig Yo, but refused that as well. Ditko did follow Jim Shooter the Valiant and then Defiant, even penciling Dark Dominion No. 0 on October of 1993, a supernatural book about alternate dimensions in which fear brings demons to life. However, the creator of Doctor Strange no longer liked the supernatural, believing it violated his objective beliefs, and left it for only 1 issue. Then, in 1992, Stan Lee approached Steve Ditko about doing a new series, Ravage 2099, as part of the new 2099 line at Marvel. They had a friendly meeting, but nothing came of it. However, their conflict would renew once again on November 16, 1998, when Stan Lee gave an interview to Time magazine and inadvertently claimed credit for the Spider-Man story, most of Spider-Man, particularly the famous story in issue number 33, If This Be My Destiny. Steve Ditko attacked with letters to Time, Marvel, and Comic Book Marketplace, which resulted in Stan Lee issuing an apology letter in August 1999. However, Ditko took issue with Lee using the phrase he was considered Steve Ditko, the co-creator of Spider-Man, especially the word considered. At this point, Lee reportedly gave up on the whole thing. Around the same time, Ditko reportedly retired from mainstream comic work. Ditko's distaste for the supernatural continued to affect his work as he turned down working for Ron Fontes because the story had a vampire. His reclusive nature hurt his professional life as well, as he refused to show up for the San Diego Comic-Con to receive the Inkpot Award in 1986. The award was sent to Ditko, but he promptly sent it back, stating he hated awards. He even refused to talk to the great Will Eisner in his Shop Talk feature in his comic book line. Most shockingly, when friends went to visit Ditko, they noticed he still had his original art he'd fought so hard for and had never sold it, despite the battles to get it back from Marvel. Instead, Ditko was living off Social Security and veterans benefits, even though, as one friend noted, his work could have netted hundreds of thousands of dollars in the auction market, if not millions. But instead, Steve Ditko just left it stacked in his apartment. In 1997, he was offered a regular series by Fantagraphics, but it didn't work out due to Ditko's unwillingness to compromise. However, Ditko's work started to grow in popularity again, and with the burgeoning trade market, DC and Marvel started releasing reprints of his old work. Seeing this marketplace, Ditko and his partner Robin Snyder decided to get back into the independent publishing with the literally titled 160-page package in 1999 and in 2000, which was a mix of superhero stories and objectivist material. The series would be end of a 32-page Tis package and the 176-page Heroes package, a black and white publication released without promotion. However, the market would once again ignore Ditko, and when he and Robin Snyder published Avenging World, a 240-page collection of Ditko's objectivist comics and essays, in the summer of 2002, no one noticed. That same year, though, Ditko was offered a job at CrossGen in 2002, but Ditko dismissed the offer, having fully lost his trust in comic book publishers. Ditko did continue to intermittently publish work with Robin Snyder, including producing comics through Kickstarter, but up to his dying day. As for his creations, Ditko continued to avoid the spotlight, even when Sam Raimi's Spider-Man movie was about to be released in the summer of 2002. While Ditko could have used the media to shame Marvel into giving him a larger financial stake, as Jack Kirby and others had done, he was only interested in being credited as Spider-Man's creator. To avoid some of this negative publicity, however, Marvel placed a co-creator credit for Ditko on the Amazing Spider-Man comic during the film's release, though it disappeared soon afterwards, unlike DC, which continues to give Ditko a co-creator credit whenever it uses one of his creations, such as The Question or the Captain Atom in any of their comic book series. Ditko did also get an interesting tribute on September 16, 2007, when Jonathan Ross produced for BBC4 In Search of Steve Ditko, a documentary about his life in which the creator, along with Neil Gaiman, tries to track him down and give an interview. Reportedly, they did get a hold of Steve Ditko, but he refused to be recorded or taped, and they did suggest some art to use for the project.